Getting to this a little late today, but hi, how you doing? Like my haircut? Still balding. Great. This is my newest episode of Weekend Reading. My Wednesday episode was Wednesday's comic book day. Even though it's for the weekend, I read on the weekend, and I talk about what comic books I'll be reading this coming weekend, what I read last weekend, and which one was my favorite. Still in the process of changing things up a bit. One thing I've noticed is that I tend to drag on a little long when it comes to explaining what I've read last weekend, particularly what my favorite is. So I'm going to make a more concerted effort to try to narrow that down, not go into so much detail about it because I tend to drone on a little bit. So before I start droning on here, let's just get started. First off, with what we had last week. We had Star Wars, The High Republic, Volume 1, There Is No Fear. Not a decent first outing, but it wasn't my favorite. Next up, we had Venom, Volume 6, King in Black, which was my favorite. It basically just wrapped up the whole King in Black story time that's been running through a bunch of books. The King in Black miniseries actually already came out itself, and I covered that a couple weeks ago, actually. I don't remember if it was my favorite of that week. I'd have to go back and check. But this basically just gave a little bit more detail of Venom's own personal experience in that, from him almost being killed by Null, the Hive God, and having to sort of exist through that experience, being part of the Hive mind as not a physical body anymore, encountering that old symbiote soldier Rex and even Flash Thompson, and him then in turn gaining the power of the gaining the power he gained at the end of King in Black that allowed him to defeat Null, the Hive God, and end up becoming the Hive God himself. Pardon me. But then it goes in a little bit afterwards. It details a little bit of the aftermath of the war, of Eddie now dealing with being the symbiote Hive God, and how he's like now connected to all the symbiotes all over the universe, and how he's responsible for that. How he warns the Avengers and all the other heroes about the Maker, the evil Reed Richards, and how he's trying to bring the Ultimate Universe back at the expense of the main Marvel Universe. Flash Thompson came back from the dead as a result of this. I don't even think they covered that in King in Black. That's just something that popped up. So now Flash Thompson's back, and he's dealing with the fact that there are now symbiotes living on Earth, and they've merged with a bunch of other humans, and people are hunting them as a result. So who knows what that's going to result in. We may get another Flash Thompson book as a result. And as for Venom himself, well, Venom's actual symbiote is now disconnected from the Hive mind. He's the only symbiote that is disconnected, and he's basically paired with Eddie Brock's teenage son, Dylan Brock, and it looks like they're the new Venom. A bit of a different look. The spider design on the front is different, and for some reason it has chains wrapped around the wrists. Dylan says that he just likes that look because he read different comic books growing up. And I think it's supposed to be a little shout out to Todd McFarlane, who was the original artist for Venom, because we know how, if you've ever seen designs for Todd McFarlane characters, he's a big fan of chains for some reason. He just likes them. So I think that was a little shout out to him. But yeah, it was a good book, good read, little wrap up to the King in Black storyline, good wrap up to this Venom series. I don't know if there's going to be another Venom series or what that's going to look like, but it left the Venom series in a very unique place, so we'll see. So that was last week. What do we got coming up this week? Well, this week we're actually doing things a little different because we're actually going back. If you saw back in previous episodes, I used to do 3 books at a time, but since the pickings have become slim lately, I've gone down to 2 at a time. This week, and for this week only, as far as I can see, we're going back to 3 at a time. Basically, I did 3 at a time this week because they're all connected. I'll explain. First up, we got Heroes Reborn America's Mightiest Heroes. This is basically just an event series covering 1 through 7. Let me just read it. A world without the Avengers, hence the event. Tony Stark never built an Iron Man armor. Thor is an atheist who despises hammers. Wakanda is dismissed as a myth. Captain America was never found in the ice because there were no Avengers to find him. Instead, this planet has always been protected by Earth's mightiest heroes, the Squadron Supreme of America. I'll explain them in a minute. Now Hyperion, Blur, Dr. Spectrum, Power Princess, and Nighthawk face an attack from some of their fiercest enemies, including Dr. Juggernaut, the Black Skull, the Silver Witch, the Goblin, and Thanos with his Infinity Rings. But why is Blade the Vampire Hunter the one man alive who seems to remember that the entire world has somehow been reborn? And what is the Daywalker going to do about it? Collecting Heroes Reborn 1 through 7 and Heroes Return number 1 by Jason Aaron, Ed McGuinness, Dale Keown, Federico Vincentini, James Stocco, R.M. Guerra, Erica De Urso, Aaron Cutter, Mark Morales, Matthew Wilson, Matt Mila, and Jason Keith. As I've stated before, I really like alternate reality stories, a rewriting of reality stories, and this has basically been building up from what they've been working on in the main Avengers series, having this background story of the Squadron Supreme being controlled by Agent Coulson. It's been building to something. As who the Squadron Supreme is, for anyone who doesn't know, it was basically something that was created, I think, in the 60s or 70s as a way for Marvel to have the Avengers face the Justice League without facing copyright infringement. So basically they created a bunch of characters originally called the Squadron Sinister, who were a bunch of evil guys, and they were basically counterparts of Superman, the Flash, Green Lantern, and Batman. And then they were like evil characters from a different dimension who just had, you know, their powers. You know, Dr. Spectrum could make things out of light. Hyperion was basically just Superman. Nighthawk was just Batman, and the Blur, or at the time he was called the Wizard, they changed the name because that name is stupid, is the Flash. And then later on they introduced a good version of this team called the Squadron Supreme, where they added a warrior woman who's basically Wonder Woman, and a few other characters who are also all basically DC ripoffs. It was Marvel's little creative way of, you know, having their rivalry with DC without actually, you know, doing that. It was just a little thing, but they're characters that have always been around. They've always ended up rivals of the Avengers, whether they've been tried to be good or not. But I've been very interested in this one, and I look forward to it. As for the other two, we have Heroes Reborn, America's Mightiest Heroes Companion, Volume 1. With a major event series like this nowadays, they have so many like one-offs and offshoots of the event series that they have to end up collecting these in their own separate things because there's just so many of them. So I figured I'd read that too. Stories from a World Without Avengers. The teenage Hyperion and his friends in the Shi'ar Imperial Guard find horror and agony in the negative zone. Peter Parker is the world's biggest Hyperion fan and also just happens to be chummy with his favorite hero thanks to a photography gig at the Daily Bugle. Years after his kind were massacred, Magneto gathers his mutant force for a deadly rescue mission. Kid Spectrum, Sam Alexander, Girl Power, Kamala Khan, and the all-new Falcon, Miles Morales, are the young squadron. And Baron Zemo leads Natasha Romanoff, Clint Barton, Scott Lang, and Victor Creed in an assault on Earth's supreme heroes. Collecting Heroes Reborn, Hyperion and the Imperial Guard, Heroes Reborn, Peter Parker, The Amazing Shutterbug, Heroes Reborn, Magneto and the Mutant Force, Heroes Reborn, Young Squadron, and Heroes Reborn, Siege Society, which is basically supposed to be this world's version of the Thunderbolts. By Ryan Caddy, Mark Bernardin, Steve Orlando, Jim Zub, Cody Ziegler, Michelle Bendini, Stephen Byrne, Raphael De La Torre, Ron Lim, Bernard Chang, Stephen Cummings, Paco Medina, Elizabeta D'Amico, Scott Hanna, Erica Arciniega, Jim Campbell, Dave Curiel, and Peter Pentazis. Interesting read. And after Companion 1, you have Heroes Reborn, Earth's Mightiest Heroes, Companion Volume Number 2. There were a lot of fucking one-shots for this miniseries, apparently, so... more tales from a world reborn. In the absence of the Avengers, the Squadron Supreme are Earth's mightiest heroes, and the changes don't end there. Some threats require a more savage approach than the Squadron can offer, and that's where Elektra and her squad, including the Punisher, Crossbones, and Cloak, come in. Police Commissioner Luke Cage has one job: eliminate vigilantes. By day, Gwendolyn Stacy is Ravencroft Asylum's leading psychiatrist, but by night she dons the guise of Nightbird. Who will protect Canada for the supremacy of the Squadron? Weapon X and Final Flight. And don't miss... Final Flight. Yep, no, I said that right. And don't miss a classic story from the days of yore. Nighthawk versus the Green Goblin on the night Sam Wilson died. Collecting Heroes Reborn, Squadron Savage, Heroes Reborn, Marvel Double Action, Heroes Reborn, American Knights, Heroes Reborn, Night Gwen, and Heroes Reborn, Weapon X, and Final Flight. By Ethan Sachs, Tim Seeley, Paul Grist, Vita Ayala, Ed Breeson, Luca Pizzari, Dan Jurgens. That's an old one. Dan Jurgens. Wait. Doesn't he work for DC? Huh. Christopher Allen, Fareed Karami, Roland Boshi, Scott Hanna, Mark Deering, Carlos Lopez, Chris Sotomayor, Guru FX, Eric Arcianega, and Chris O'Halloran. I can already predict that the main miniseries is going to be my favorite of this week, but considering it's all just one big thing, I mean, how do you differentiate? But I'll talk about it. I'll probably talk about all of them a little bit next week, so maybe. I don't know. Now we're moving on to what I like to call the main event. Sorry, my mouth's a little dry. My apologies. No question of the week this week. This week we're going back to my whole abandoned plots. Yeah, okay. Abandoned plots, for anyone who isn't aware or might be new, is where I go over storylines or comic books or character developments that were introduced in comic books as sort of a big thing and then were either just completely abandoned or quickly brought to a close that you know was premature, that you know wasn't originally planned. And this week I want to talk about a big one that's been on my mind a lot. The Inhumans. Let's rewind it back a little bit. Who the fuck are the Inhumans, you might be asking? Well, in the mid to late 60s, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, though probably more Jack Kirby, introduced a group of characters in the Fantastic Four called the Inhumans. This is after the X-Men had already existed, so whether the X-Men and mutants already inspired this, I'm not sure. But the Inhumans were created as this separate group of humanity who had special powers. But and they were essentially born Inhumans, but unlike mutants who just develop these abilities when they turn a certain age, Inhumans have to be exposed to this stuff called Terrigen Mist. That's created by putting these Terrigen crystals they have in water, and it creates this mist. It dissolves the crystals and then creates this mist called Terrigen Mist that then it activates their Inhuman powers. And no Inhumans have the same powers. Some still look pretty normal with Inhuman abilities. Others become completely Inhuman looking. They're interesting characters, but they've always been side characters. Every now and then they've been able to lead their own series. I think they had a series introduced in the 60s or 70s that lasted for a little bit. They pitched one in the 90s. They kind of repitched them in the 90s. It didn't really last, and they've always just sort of been background characters that were just sort of thrown in to maybe create an interesting story. Fast forward to somewhere in the 2010s. Marvel, at this point, was making movies. And they were making a lot of movies. They're making movies and TV shows. And they're making a lot of money off of it. And Disney had now owned Marvel at this point, and there was a lot of money to be made off of characters. The problem is, in the 70s and 80s, Stan Lee, who was running Marvel at the time, also wanted to make movies and TV shows. The problem is he only had a publishing company. He didn't have a studio. Marvel didn't have the capability to make a studio at back in those days. So he sold the rights, the movie and filming rights of said characters to various studios back in the day. So for decades, Marvel didn't own the television or movie rights to a bunch of their characters. In fact, to some, they still don't. When it comes to the Spider-Man characters, Sony still owns the rights to all of those characters. They have a deal with Marvel now where they kind of share Spider-Man, but God only knows how long that's going to last. It seems like it's already on shaky ground, so that might be coming to an end. But they've been trying to get that back. Basically, the way it works is when you own the rights to someone else's characters, you're basically renting it, because if you don't use the characters in a certain amount of time, the rights reverts to the original holder. So if any of the studios don't make a TV show or movie using any of those characters that they own the rights to within a certain amount of years, the rights revert back to Marvel. Like for years, Fox owned the rights to the Fantastic Four and the X-Men. And at the time, they weren't making a lot of good movies out of those characters, particularly with the Fantastic Four. The X-Men were a little bit more successful. For the Fantastic Four, they were making utter dog shit. And Marvel had a couple of characters revert back to them, even some that Fox owned, like the Punisher. But they wanted the Fantastic Four and X-Men back. And they started playing hardball. So one thing they did is they basically eliminated the Fantastic Four comic book. Just completely. They just, for like a couple years, they just weren't publishing the Fantastic Four at all. Because it's a comic book that they figured they could afford to lose. And they did. And it didn't really hurt them that much. What does this have to do with the Inhumans, you might be asking? Okay. Well, they were able to eliminate the Fantastic Four, but remember, I said Fox also owned the rights to the X-Men. Marvel cannot just cut the X-Men loose. The X-Men, especially since the 90s, has been a major selling comic book for Marvel. They have several X-Men comic books at any given time. They can't just afford to they couldn't get rid of those. It would have been a disaster if they had done that. So it became clear that Marvel Comics was trying something. They were trying to create a replacement for the X-Men. And what did they find? We have the Inhumans. Characters who are almost exactly like mutants, and we could sort of pitch the same way because they're even weirder. So in comes this story called Infinity. It's one of these big major events. And in Infinity, Thanos attacks the city of Attilan and fights Black Bolt. During the fight, Attilan is destroyed. Black Bolt is feared dead. And the Terrigen crystals inside Attilan get destroyed and create this giant cloud of mist that two giant clouds of mist that then spread all over the Earth. They then spread all over the Earth, and in doing so, they start activating the Inhuman genes of anyone who has any trace of Inhuman in them. Because not everybody who is because remember, Inhumans are just normal humans until their Inhuman gene gets activated. And there's people who might have recessive Inhuman genes in them that might not even realize it. So people all over the world start turning into Inhumans, so you now have all these hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of new Inhumans. Out of that spawns a new comic book called Inhumanity. Yes, Inhumanity. And it deals with a lot of these new Inhumans. Some of them were interesting. It seemed like an interesting story, but as it can see when a comic book is struggling, they decide to start rebooting it. They start rebooting number ones. That's Marvel's thing. When they want to keep things interesting, just reboot the story, just reboot the comic book and create a new number one. Maybe change the title a little, change the change the title, change some of the characters up a little bit, change their costumes. Inhumanity now became the all-new Inhumans. And then, after that, all-new Inhumans became the Uncanny Inhumans. Uncanny, like the Uncanny X-Men. I mean, it was almost right on the fucking nose there. And then after that, the book became known as Royals. And you had the Inhumans actually it was almost like they were just like challenging people to say it out loud, because they actually had an event where the Inhumans came into conflict with the X-Men. Like the last time I did the whole abandoned plots thing, I talked about Mpox and the Death of X storyline. That's all because of the Terrigen Mist cloud that created the Mpox that was killing mutants. So you literally had what was causing the rise in Inhumans was killing the mutants. It's almost like they were screaming it from the rooftops that this is what they wanted to do. They wanted to get rid of the mutants and make Inhumans the main thing. There was even an idea for an Inhumans movie that eventually became a TV show that nobody watched. So that happened, and then there was even an Inhumans, an X-Men, was it Inhumans versus X-Men or X-Men versus Inhumans miniseries that occurred. And it left the Inhumans in a weird place at the end of it. And that's where the whole Royal storyline came after that. Then, the Royal storyline looked like it might be a way to, like, kind of salvage what was going on with the Inhumans, because you could see the whole thing was spiraling. But it just didn't occur, because then the final event the Inhumans were part of was called the Death of the Inhumans, where they essentially killed all the new Inhumans they had. I mean, destroyed the entire Inhuman society that they had built up in the previous years with all these comic books, and just left a handful of them left. I mean, there was a bunch of even, like, the whole Inhuman thing spawned, like, there was even a Black Bolt comic book, a comic book for this Karnak comic book, who are two major characters from the Inhuman storylines over the years. They introduced a new Inhuman called Mosaic, who nobody gives two shits about. The only Inhuman that really took off in popularity in recent years was Miss Marvel, and she really has little to no connection to the Inhumans majorly, other than she is one. And nobody really cares about that. She's just a popular character because she's just popular in and of herself. But she's the only one who's still around. She's even going to be part of the next Miss Marvel movie, or Captain Marvel movie. We'll see how they deal with her origin, though, because God only knows if they're going to do Inhumans there. But she's the only one whose comic book is still around. All the others have died off. And Marvel eventually, or Disney eventually, merged with Fox to basically buy their entire movie division, owning the rights, basically getting the rights to every movie franchise that they owned, including the X-Men and the Fantastic Four. And then the Fantastic Four came back. Any thoughts of the Inhumans beyond Miss Marvel were just put to bed. The X-Men are back to their place in prominence. All was right with the world. But it was pretty clear that Marvel denied it, but it was pretty clear that they were trying to replace the X-Men with the Inhumans, and it just didn't work, because the Inhumans never worked. Hell, the X-Men almost didn't work when they were originally introduced. It took creating an incredibly diverse new team to actually make them, interesting to people at large. But it just goes to show that, sometimes the movies and TV shit influence the comic books a little too much. I don't like it. I don't like it at all. It should be the other way around, as far as I'm concerned. And this is one of those times where they really tried to have that be the case, where they were really trying to just almost bully the movie and TV end of things with the comic book, and it just didn't fucking work, because they didn't realize the comic books are great for source material, but when it comes to the money-making end, it's going to be the movies and the TV shows that matter. It ain't the fucking comic books. You know, it's just not. It's great for fucking fanboys like me who refuse to grow up, but, you know, for people at large, they could give two shits. They could give two shits. There's decades worth of source material to read through. Nobody's gonna fucking do that unless they really have a love for this bullshit. So yeah, that's just covering the weird little fucking saga of the Inhumans that was meant to be Marvel's next big thing and ended up just being such a disastrous failure that they essentially killed off decades-old characters. So who would even try to use them anymore? It's like almost none of them are still around. Only a handful of them. All the new characters they created are just gone. They're just gone. They're literally just dead. It's so fucking crazy. But yeah, it's crazy. So yeah, that was my abandoned plots story or thing of this week. Just something I wanted to recognize. I got more. So, and I'll think of more as time goes on. But yeah, that's this week's episode of Weekend Reading. I hope you enjoy your weekend, and I hope you enjoy your reading. Have a good one.